Good evening.
Good evening.
Richard Jordan's in the house. I can always remember he's here. Good evening. I'm Adam Lupel, IPI Vice President. And it really is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening event on the occasion of the annual United Nations High-Level Forum on the Culture of Peace. This event is in part a celebration. A celebration marking 20 years since the adoption of General Assembly Resolution 53-43 on the Declaration and Program of Action on a Culture of Peace. And as we look back on those 20 years in retrospect, the Declaration and the Program of Action can be seen in the context of a larger process that connects the culture of peace to the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Indeed, the 1999 Declaration identified political, economic, environmental, education, and health-related components of peaceful societies, anticipating the holistic approach agreed to in the 2030 Agenda more than 15 years later. What both agendas recognize is that to achieve a sustainable peace, one needs to do more than end conflict or stop violence. One needs to build positive foundations for mutual respect, prosperity, and broad-based inclusion. This, I think, is a key message for our troubled times, when division and exclusion seem to be the order of the day. As we celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Program of Action on a Culture of Peace, and we prepare to enter the final decade of implementation of the SDGs, all our efforts need to turn to concrete action. And to be more effective in delivering on the promises of the culture of peace and sustainable development, we need to do a better job of aligning such agendas across the UN system, in the field, in headquarters, and in capitals around the world. Doing so is easier said than done, but doing so takes leadership. And so we are truly fortunate to have with us tonight two exemplary leaders of the cause to provide us with some guidance, some opening remarks for our discussion. We have Ambassador Anurul Chowdhury, founder of the Global Movement for a Culture of Peace, former permanent representative of Bangladesh to the United Nations, and former Undersecretary General and High Representative of the United Nations for the least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, and small island developing states. He is well known in the community around the culture of peace, chairing the high-level forum every year. But before we turn the floor to Ambassador Chowdhury, I am honored to introduce Her Excellency Maria Fernanda Espinosa Garces, President of the 73rd session of the UN General Assembly, and I want to take this opportunity to thank Madam President and her office for a truly productive partnership all year long. We at IPI have had the privilege of working with the Office of the PGA on a series of events this year, including sessions on women in diplomacy, meaningful inclusion of young people, and building trust and the importance of multilateralism, all of which contributed to a comprehensive program of work that was laid out by the PGA around this time last year with the exemplary goal of improving inclusive processes at the UN to make the UN relevant for all people, and I would say also add to contribute to a universal culture of peace. And so, as we enter what indeed are the final days of the 73rd session of the General Assembly, please join me in congratulating President Espinosa for a wonderfully successful session. It has been a true pleasure to work with you.
at my level. Oh, now I see you here.
Yeah.
Okay. We were together just before. But good evening, everybody. Ambassador Chowdhury, it is such a privilege to be with you tonight. Dear Adam and IPI, dear Abduli Tuhami, it is such an honor also to be with you this evening. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed a pleasure to join you for this discussion, which I very much see as a curtain raiser for the high-level forum on the culture of peace. I am really very, very grateful to IPI for organizing this event and for the productive and warm partnership that we have had over the course of this session of the General Assembly. It is such a fantastic resource for the UN to have a world-class think tank and convener just across the road. This is really a privilege, so thank you. And I am extremely grateful for the support from the Al Babtain Cultural Foundation, which has been such a steadfast supporter of this agenda on the culture of peace. This year, we, as Adam mentioned before, we are marking the 20th anniversary of the Declaration and Program of Action on a Culture of Peace, which saw the General Assembly call for a transition from a culture of war to a culture of peace. I am not going to go into the history of that decision because we have with us the father of the culture of peace, Ambassador Chowdhury. Instead, I will outline a few thoughts on the context for realizing a culture of peace in 1999 and today. There is a palpable sense of optimism in the General Assembly resolution adopted 20 years ago on the eve of a new millennium about the potential for international cooperation in a post-Cold War world. The following year, Member States adopted the Millennium Declaration with its pillars on peace, development, and human rights, and laid the groundwork for the Millennium Development Goals, as well as the new mechanisms and reforms that would be agreed 5 years later. That high water mark of optimism now seems very remote indeed. Earlier in the week, my office organized a dialogue on multilateralism with the presidents of ECOSOC, the Security Council, and the Secretary General, and it is fair to say that there was a certain wariness, especially as we approach the end of a session with 178 agenda items and 340 resolutions, many of which were the subject of very intense debate. Throughout this session, we have seen backsliding on international laws and norms, and a backlash against agenda adopted 25 years ago. We have seen the consequences of the crises we face, environmental, political, economic, and social, in rising unilateralism, nationalist populism, and extremist ideologies. And we have seen the impacts of these trends on hard-won multilateral agreements and institutions, and in the loss of trust between people, governments, and institutions. In this context, the declaration exhortation that peace requires a positive, dynamic, participatory process where dialogue is encouraged and conflicts resolved in a spirit of mutual understanding seems at once remote and sorely needed. And yet, while this is certainly a moment of crisis, it is also one of opportunity and of ambition, even if that ambition results from a recognition that we have no option other than to pursue transformative changes to our societies and economies. The fact is that despite of the headwinds facing multilateralism in recent years, the international community has been able to agree the most ambitious, wide-ranging set of sustainable development goals, as well as a universal framework for action to address climate change, the Paris Agreement. this session, we were able to agree on compacts on refugees and migration, and over 2/3 of the General Assembly's resolutions were adopted by consensus. So we should seize the moment to reinvigorate our efforts to implement the 1999 Declaration. The vision set out in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development captures well the spirit of the culture of peace and includes concrete targets for making progress on its various elements. At the same time, the 1999 Declaration calls for action on issues that seem very pertinent today. The need to address social and economic inequalities, for instance, or addressing violence in new communication technologies. The horrific attacks in New Zealand, Sri Lanka, the United States, and elsewhere were tragic reminders of the need to tackle hate speech and its dissemination online. Of course, there are issues that we would want to include in the declaration if it were negotiated today. The climate emergency, for example, the displacement crisis, the rising threats to democracy, for instance. So let us strive to lift up the culture of peace in our efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. It is more than a phrase in the 2030 Agenda. On the contrary, it provides the foundations for it. The Constitution of UNESCO begins with the famous words, and I quote, "Since wars begin in the minds of humans, it is in the minds of humans that the defenses of peace must be constructed." That is certainly true, but let us take the notion of a culture of peace out of our minds and make it a reality, something we can implement in our daily lives and local actions, and something we work towards as an international community, of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. Ambassador Chowdhury, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Duper, and good evening to all of you. It's a pleasure that I'm invited here to speak, following the comments made, very pertinent comment made by our President, distinguished President. But before I start, let me warn you that bear with me. I will be few minutes more than I have been assigned to speak. So please excuse me for that. Allow me, Madam President and colleagues here, to pay tribute to our dear President in getting the United Nations to do its part on banning single-use plastic. Not only at the UN headquarters, but also in the offices. Bravo, Madam President. It has been a long, arduous journey, a journey ridden curiously with both obstacles and indifference. Since July 1997, when I took the initiative to write to our much loved Secretary General Kofi Annan to create a separate item of the agenda of the General Assembly on the culture of peace. The path and progress of the culture of peace at UN have been uneven, to say the least. For being a part of this journey, first of all, I pay tribute to Bangladeshi diplomats who have been true co-travelers. Ambassador Masood bin Momen, whom I hold in great affection, will speak this evening, and I will borrow 3 minutes from your time. This IPI event is taking place exactly on the eve of that date when 20 years ago the UN took its most forward-looking stride in ensuring a peaceful planet for all of us since the Charter of the United Nations in 1945. Dare I say that? The UN Charter arose out of the ashes of the Second World War, and the UN Declaration and the Program of Action on Culture of Peace emerged in the aftermath of the long-drawn Cold War. 2 decades have passed by since 13 September 1999, when the United Nations adopted by consensus and without any reservation a monumental document on the culture of peace that transcends boundaries, cultures, societies, and nations. And here it is in the commemorative edition of the Culture of Peace booklet. It was an honor for me to chair the 9-month-long open-ended negotiations that led to the agreement on this historic norm-setting document that is considered as one of the most significant legacies of the United Nations that would, I expect, endure generations. I introduced the agreed text of that document. Mr. Lubel mentioned about it, 53-243, on behalf of all member states for adoption by the Assembly with its President, Didier Oparti of Uruguay, chairing the meeting. Through this landmark adoption, the General Assembly laid down humanity's charter for the new approaching millennium. In simple terms, the culture of peace as a concept means that every one of us needs to consciously make peace and non-violence a part of our daily existence. We should not isolate peace as something separate or distant. We should know how to relate to one another without being aggressive, without being violent, without being disrespectful, without neglect, without prejudice. In today's world, more so, it should be seen as the essence of a new humanity based on inner oneness and outer diversity. Many treat peace and culture of peace synonymously. Actually, when we speak of peace, we expect others, namely politicians, diplomats, or other practitioners, to take the initiative. While when we speak of the culture of peace, we know that the initial action begins with each one of us. The essence of the culture of peace is a process of individual, collective, and institutional transformation. The objective of the culture of peace is the empowerment of people. Through the Declaration and Program of Action is an agreement, though the Declaration and Program of Action is an agreement among nations, governments, civil society, media, and individuals are all identified in this document as key actors. The UN General Assembly decided on the culture of peace before the Millennium Development Goals. SDGs came 15 years later. Many would recall that Goal 16, the so-called peace goal, was almost dropped when the developing countries wanted to include a reference to the culture of peace. A compromise, Goal 16, could be agreed without it. Bangladesh brought the reference to the culture of peace in Goal 4 in its Target 4.7, which identified culture of peace and non-violence, as well as global citizenship in the educational context. And I'm very happy to say that the Bangladesh diplomat who made this possible is Sadia Faizunnesa, now the Consul General of Bangladesh, and she's here. In the second row, and all 8 action areas in the Culture of Peace program are reflected in various SDGs. I can, however, say with pride that the culture of peace would outlast the SDGs and make more deep-rooted and long-lasting contribution to a sustainable and peaceful planet of ours when UN observes its 30th anniversary. Let me end by outlining the 3 integrated mainstream for the coming years, bolstering the global movement for the culture of peace. Number 1, education. All educational institutions need to offer opportunities that prepare the students not only to live fulfilling lives, but also to be responsible and productive citizens of the world. This should more appropriately be called education for global citizenship. If our minds could be likened to a computer, then education provides the software with which to reboot our priorities and actions for transition from force to reason, from conflict to dialogue. Number 2, women. As I always say emphatically, without peace, development cannot be realized. Without development, peace is not achievable. But without women, neither peace nor development is possible. And number 3, youth and children. It is essential to recognize the empowerment of young people as a major element in building the culture of peace. Young people of today should embrace the culture of peace in a way that can not only shape their lives, but can also shape the future of the world. For this, I believe that the early childhood affords a window of opportunity for us to sow the seeds of transition to the culture of peace from an early life. Since 2012, when the first UN High-Level Forum was convened by PGA 66, Ambassador Nasir Al-Nasser, the UNGA mandated this annual forum, and tomorrow is the 8th one, and to be observed as the 20th anniversary of the document. This mandate has, and I quote, an opportunity for renewing the commitments to strengthen further the global movement for the culture of peace, end of quote. The culture of peace is not a quick fix. It is a movement. It is not a revolution. As former Secretary General of the United Nations and Nobel Peace Laureate Kofi Annan had profoundly said, and I quote him, "Over the years, we have come to realize that it is not enough to send peacekeeping forces to separate warring parties. It is not enough to engage in peace-building efforts after societies have been ravaged by conflict. It is not enough to conduct preventive diplomacy. All of this is essential work, but we want enduring results. We need, in short, the culture of peace." End of quote. The seed of peace exists in all of us. It must be nurtured, cared for, and promoted by us all to flourish. Peace cannot be imposed from outside. It must be realized from within. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Chowdhury. It's tremendous to get that historical perspective, and also to really see so clearly the connections to today. I mean, the PGA described 1999 as this high water mark of optimism, and the way you describe how it comes together really makes me reflect upon the comparisons with today. How much, in one way, how much further we feel in this process of transitioning from a culture of war to a culture of peace. And yet, we cannot despair, because we look around and see so much activity happening, both in the General Assembly and elsewhere, where there is a lot of cooperation and resolutions being passed, movements being created that I think support this agenda. And the SDGs, I think, are the key hook, especially at this particular moment as we enter a critical phase of the next 10 years in which implementation is critically important. To mobilize and focus the mind on achieving these goals. I found the story that you told about how the culture of peace got into the SDGs and go forward really fascinating, and I wanted to talk to Ambassador Moment about that a bit. Bangladesh has been, as I mentioned, has been a champion of this agenda from the very beginning. And we were talking behind in the green room, so to speak, before this, and you mentioned the commitment to education. And I was wondering if maybe you could share with us some of your experience in this regard.
Thank you, Adam, for giving me the opportunity to address the audience here on the eve of the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the culture of peace. And we are grateful for the presence of Ambassador Anwar Karim Chaudhry, one of my most illustrious predecessors, whom we owe this resolution and all the subsequent years that his contribution towards this very noble cause. I would like to also mention, before going to the education area, that it is perhaps not a coincidence that in 1997, the government of Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina actually successfully had this treaty, the peace treaty in Chittagong Hill Tracts, in one of our hilly and mountainous regions with some ethnic minority population. Although Bangladesh has been living in harmony with various ethnic and religious minorities over quite a number of centuries, but between 1976-77 to 1996, for 2 decades we had armed insurgency with one of our ethnic minorities, and it was Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's first government who took the initiative to have this Chittagong Hill Tracts Peace Treaty, and the treaty is still holding. We're still implementing. So around the same time, I think the initiative was also taken here at the UN by including this very important agenda item, and therefore this agenda item and our national aspiration to have peace not only domestically but also, of course, internationally is very dear to us. And over the years, you must have also noticed that Bangladesh, being geographically a kind of small country, but our footprint in the UN peacekeeping operations huge. Right now we are number 2nd or number 3 in terms of the numbers. but in terms of the multidimensional aspects and also in terms of the number of peacekeeping operations, we are perhaps one of the top right now. Therefore, these are all not just coincidences, and these are our conscious sort of effort as a nation to make a statement in the Committee of Nations. Now, as you mentioned that Ambassador Chaudhary also mentioned that there were difficulties in SDG 16 to incorporate the culture of peace. But education, which is also an important area in the 8 areas of the program of action and declaration. So perhaps our colleagues thought that that could be a real sort of entry point for this important notion to be included in the SDG document. And from the very birth of our nation, we have been also investing a lot in terms of educating our people and also in terms of improving the literacy rate. And we have achieved 100% enrollment, and also especially the enrollment and the continuation of the girl child in the schools. So now we have achieved all that, but of course more can be done in terms of the quality of education. That's where we are now concentrating, and also the foundation leader is here. We have been also pushing how to include the culture of peace sort of notions and various pillars into our curricula. So I've been just also discussing with him in the green room that how we can convince our new education minister so that Bangladesh can actually lead by example in terms of getting these the handbooks and other materials that he has developed or his foundation has developed, how to put it there. If you allow me, I would also like to all the good things that have been said by both the PGA and Ambassador Chaudhary, but I would like to mention a challenge, a particular challenge, not for Bangladesh alone, but for all the countries, and that is while we are trying to inculcate this notion of culture of peace in the minds of our children, we are seeing that our children are getting more and more hooked and addicted to all these video games and other materials which are actually promoting violence. And it is not only the children, some of the games, the adults are also addicted, and we are seeing the results of the fallouts not only in the USA but also in other countries, causing not only deaths but also other kinds of physical and mental injuries. So I would like to also share this with the audience here, that this how to tackle this challenge. And I was thinking that we have to build a new alliance or partnership, which is also part of the SDGs, to include the game developers, the software developers, the tech companies, private sector, NGOs, civil society, psychologists or sociologists, and of course the governments, to devise a way out of this and how to persuade them to the curricula that you have developed, how to include that or incorporate that, integrate that in some of these games, so that children have these options also. Because nowadays children are not only going through the written materials, but they are more interested in internet-based studies or self whatever they're doing. So we have to catch them or catch their imaginations through that medium also. Otherwise, I think we are going to a very dangerous phase. And of course, the Secretary General and the UN is also fully seized, and the Secretary General's recent this digital high-level commission that he has set up, come up with the recommendations and report. So the member states will very soon embark on some form of regulatory framework or whatever you call it. But I think it is important that the culture of peace advocacy groups also get involved in that process, so that we can actually work with other stakeholders to build a future where we can shun violence and promote peace. That is very important.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it makes me think, the PGA in her remarks mentioned a few things, thinking about 20 years later, what we might want to add if we revisited the Declaration of the Culture of Peace. You mentioned migration, climate change, threats to democracy, and I think certainly the new media environment is something that could not have been anticipated, and both as a threat and an opportunity that can be used to help promote the culture of peace. And I think this proposal for new partnerships also really is very much squarely in the spirit of the SDGs as partnerships. And so if I could turn to you, Jimena. Before you came, Jimena is our research fellow here at IPI who works on the SDGs. Before she came to IPI, she was one of the lead negotiators at the Guatemala mission, and when Goal 4 was mentioned, the Bangladeshi Consul General pointed to Jimena and said, "She was with me, she was with me." So you were there, you were part of the negotiating team, negotiating the 2030 agenda with the G77, I believe, is that right? Could you give us a bit of your perspective of the SDGs as a holistic agenda and as it relates to these issues, culture, peace, and such?
Thank you, Adam, and thank you so much for this. Thank you so much for.
It takes a second. Okay. It's a real honor to be here among such distinguished guests, and it's really great to see Sadia after many years and other friends here tonight. I want to start by asking you to raise your hands if you now feel overwhelmed when you look at the news. Who feels overwhelmed by the news? The press. Overwhelmed. Who shutdowns and just prefer to put a Netflix show or something that's completely off. I'm guilty as charged, I can say that. So I feel that in this moment of troubled times, sometimes our innate mechanism is just to shut down. But truly what we've been exploring at IPI and at a personal level, it's that this time also offers a moment and an hidden opportunity of self-awareness. Because in 2015, a lot of us were in an ultimate high, right? We had achieved this global agenda. We had also achieved the Paris Agreement. Wow, it really felt like things were transforming and changing, and it really did feel like the world as a whole was moving as one, as Ambassador Chowdhury reflected also for his time. And so moving fast forwarding 4 years to the present, I feel it's been a road of inner reflection and understanding that we are kind of in the dark time of the soul, but in that dark time also brings treasures. And those treasures is that self-awareness and that moment of continuing and continuing to challenge the narratives that Ambassador Manuel just mentioned, continuing the cultural narratives and to challenge the assumptions that we live, because culture is everything and nothing at the same time. It's the framework that we walk and live and judge without even knowing. It's the culture that tells us boys should not cry, girls should be the vulnerable and the mothers and the caring. So culture is something so broad and so complex. So this moment is a moment in which we can reflect and think, oh, maybe these assumptions are no longer true. What do we need to change to make a difference? And how does this relate to the 2030 agenda? The biggest promise of the 2030 agenda is transforming our world. And the only way we will transform our world is through changing our minds, how we relate to each other and how we work with each other. And this is a very big challenge at a personal level, just trying to do something new. It takes 3 weeks for any human being to build a new habit. Can you imagine changing the way the UN works? We know it's been a very bumpy road for the UNDS reform and how to get everyone aligned to this agenda, to get the funding being a transformational, a comparative role instead of a competitive tool. So it's definitely, it has to change the organizational culture of the UN from a culture that has its noble goals, but it still needs to build from that oneness and that holistic nature of the 2030 agenda. So those are some of thoughts. Thank you.
I always remember is my shot of optimism at IPI always. I think there's no doubt that crisis breeds opportunity, and I think that something that I've learned from you is, yes, culture is everything. The culture piece belonged at the heart, actually, of the SDGs, but I understand now that the debate, relegated it to goal 4. But what the SDGs, in my mind, does is it makes it concrete. There are targets that we can seize upon and we can work on. And one of the connections that I see between the declaration, the program of action, and the SDGs is that they are both holistic and understand that all these things are related. We need to work on them all together, but at the same time, as Ambassador Chowdhury says, it's not a quick fix. This is something that is long-term, and we can each kind of maybe identify one small part that we can make our contribution on, whether it's target X or target Y or contribution to culture or educating our children. Last night, I think maybe some of you were here, we had an event last night with Ambassador Samantha Power, former USPR. And she said something that struck me, and I guess it's not original to her. She mentioned whose idea it was, I forget what it was. But she said that when in conversation with Obama and such, they often said sometimes you need to shrink the change. Sometimes the problems are so overwhelming that you feel defeated by just looking at them. But if you can shrink the change to think about what is the one little corner of action that you can attack, that you can personally do, it starts to get more manageable. And in the long term, this is a movement that is a collection of people working towards these big goals over time. And I like to think that that's something that we're all involved in here in this room and in IPI. I mentioned at the beginning that this is in part a celebration, and so there is a reception here, and so I do want to be sure to have some time to just mingle amongst each other, but also I want to give the opportunity to anybody to interject, give a expression of their experience, a question, anything. The floor is open to anybody who would like to participate. Yes, please.
Hi, I am Birjan Ömer and I represent the Light Millennium Organization, and I am a proud member of the Global Movement for the Culture of Peace, and thanks for Ambassador Chowdhury's long-run, lifetime championships to that. But whenever I came up with a question, it may not seeming from the positive perspective, but like the skeleton of the what doesn't work or why we are here in terms of the world as of today. Just I will give an example and then I will kind of try to say what I want to say. I think it was September 9th. There was a nuclear test ban treaty, and I ran to the disarmament department, and I always struck me the numbers daily military expenditures. I deeply and truly and fully respect Ambassador Chowdhury's inner peace, and everything starts within. But I can't stop asking, when the world is spending from the early hours of the morning about $3 billion, I want to get permission to point from the first moment, 24 hours, what is going to end up the billion, how many $billion. So how, the question is, I think, for everyone, for every level, how are we going to able to tackle with that money, funding, human resources, and the global, the world is disrupting, to reverse to human development? That's all my question lingering in my mind all the time. Thank you.
Yes.
Is that a question or are you going to answer first?
Well, you know, we can take a number of questions or interventions, yeah.
First, I wanted to thank everyone, and great job, all three of you on stage, and thank you for your time. I want to say first, I'd say for the millennial generation, or being 30, as I'm a millennial, I have a lot of optimism. Some of my optimism comes from Steven Pinker's data, not just Steven Pinker's data, but if you really look at overall, in many ways, we're at the most peaceful time in human history when it comes to violence. We are killing each other less by ratio than ever before. And so, obviously, there's hyper-nationalism and wild things happening ecologically, you know, the rainforest and much more with climate change. But there's a lot of signs for beautiful hope, and just wanted to kind of put that out there that, I mean, if you really look at how many people are dying from war each year, it's quite a bit less than it was a generation or two generations ago, which is very exciting. But the other thing I just wanted to maybe suggest, I find intergenerational dialogue just to be so not only captivating, but also beneficial for everyone. And I do think we're finally getting the time where millennials are approaching the age of being ready to help lead with the older generation. And I read this really amazing article the other day that was about the US government system in general, and just the average age of people in office is almost like 68 or 70 or something. And I find that when I'm with a lot of my generation, that we have quite a bit of knowledge of solutions that sometimes the older generation doesn't even recognize is available, such as, you know, blockchain technologies and regenerative agriculture and things to this nature. So anyway, I just wanted to encourage that with all these amazing ambassadors of peace and all these amazing leaders in the room, that if you do events, I just really encourage you to have intergenerational dialogue as much as possible, because I think it really facilitates also just a dynamic conversation that brings us all more forward.
Yes, please, microphone.
Thank you very much, Martha Gallagher from the United Religions Initiative. I'm following a peace builder. I recognize you. I wanted to reiterate something that came up tonight, actually, which is that I happen to believe as well that the Declaration and Program of Action on the Culture of Peace is going to outlive the Sustainable Development Goals from the perspective of the long view. And that at the same time, I'm aware that it's, in order to get there, part of what we can do is something else that came up tonight, which is to be thinking about what we're going to say in 2030 when it's time to create another agenda. My question is, what would you suggest we be thinking about in terms of the media that you think the countries might espouse in terms of moving forward in a transforming way? Thank you.
Great. You want to slow?
Yes.
We can take one more, yeah, please. Second row.
I think we're all in this room because of the United Nations. And Ambassador Chowdhury tried to remind us about when and why it was founded, but I don't think we heard its real purpose. And the UN in the Charter says, "We the peoples determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war." So why aren't we talking about the institution of war that should be abolished, that should be put an end to? Because it's not just the money. But when you make a war in a country and your soldiers leave, you leave behind the toxicity, the pollution, the horrors of war that continue after the so-called war is over. So people are dying for years after the dropping of the bomb in Hiroshima. People are dying from radiation. Atom bombs are being made better. Why? There's something basic about the UN that I don't think we're grappling with. How do you get rid of war?
Great impossible question. I mean, the first, oh, we can take one more, yeah, absolutely, please.
So to say thank you, everyone that's here today. I think some really good points in terms of looking at both sides, letting go of gender roles and really coming together to have a conversation about how we can cultivate a culture of peace. And I think that when we look at what cultures exist today that may have insight into this, and I want to just say that I think indigenous cultures also could be a very important resource because we're all indigenous people of this planet. And some are in different modalities of alignments to the Mother Earth. And I think that it's important to consider voices from all of these cultures, especially ones that already have peace in the center of it.
Great, good. Thanks so much. I mean, I think inclusion, is fundamentally critical to both the culture of peace and the sustainable development as a critical part of creating sustainable peace and sustainably peaceful societies. And that includes indigenous cultures, it includes youth and women and diversity of opinions and ethnicities and like. But we can't just say that. We actually have to enact that as we have these conversations and others. I mean, on the questions, I think that the first question and the fourth is it's not just money, but how do you abolish war? How do you get rid of war? Incredibly difficult conversation to have, but I think getting back to you started by saying what is the United Nations? Of course, the United Nations is made up of member states, and the military-industrial complex is rooted in the order of most states. I have no answer to that, but I think you're absolutely part of the problem. But Christopher, signs of beautiful hope. I love that. And I absolutely agree with you in terms of need to include youth and intergenerational dialogue. We try to do that at IPI all the time. What do we say in the media? I'll leave that to you to answer, especially sort of in the context of the next 10 years implementing the SDGs. Yes, the Declaration of Program of Action will outlive the SDGs because the SDGs have an end date, 2030. The culture of peace is long term, so I think that goes without saying. It will outlive, and we need to remain committed to it. So, how would you like to respond?
I mean, all the questions were, of course, very important, but the answers are somewhat elusive, especially how do we stop war. I have visited Hiroshima and Nagasaki a number of times because I was ambassador of Bangladesh in Japan before coming here. And I also talked to some of the survivors and also try to understand their pain. But the problem is now the world has got bombs which are like 100 times, 1,000 times more powerful and devastating than the ones that were used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So obviously, potentially we are at a much more dangerous level. But as you mentioned, the military-industrial complex is also very strong, and the UN system that we have with the vetoes, threats by the permanent members, that also creates certain hindrances to have, especially in the case of war and peace. There are now some movements that how to restrain the use of veto, as with all, especially in the case of mass killings or some sort of genocides. So these are some of the good signs. But I fully agree with the gentleman at the back, the millennial, that our hopes are actually lying with you, and the importance of conversation with the new generation and the older generation is also very important, and the culture of peace also provides us a kind of tool for us so that the new generation can come up with bolder sort of viewpoints, and this is one planet that we are talking about, and I like the word the last speaker, that we are all indigenous to the world in our own form. So we have all responsibility to save our planet and from the environmental disaster that we ourselves are responsible. Therefore, when I see people of my contemporary sort of times, I don't feel that much encouraged, because we are still, acting like our predecessors in terms of protecting our own interest, or trying to hide behind sometimes narrow national interests. But when I mix with the younger people, with school children or teenagers, then I can see there's a sea change in terms of values and aspirations. So I am hopeful, that in the future we will be able to change this kind of toxicity that is prevailing right now. Great.
Thank you. I know I don't want to stand between us and having a glass of wine, so I will be very brief. I think it's really important to recognize that we're living on unprecedented times, and that it is a moment to stand up and to act beyond your comfort zone, to be, cities are standing up, they're being sanctuary cities, mayors are challenging the federal in terms of climate change. It is a moment of, in a way, rebellion against some of the norms and the status quo and the narratives that are polluting the minds of our children. So it is a moment of standing up and using our channels that are now available through YouTube and others to be that change you want to see in the world. And the last thing is, as a new mother, your heart physically expands when you give birth. And I feel that the culture of peace document expanded the heart and the mind of our collective consciousness. The 2030 agenda did a similar thing. So for me, it's a constant expansion that will just grow and grow and grow the values of leaving no one behind, of having a universal agenda, of having integrated. It builds on the culture of peace, and I hope it will just expand to all of us.
Just to add one last point, next year we'll be again celebrating the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. I think that will give us a fresh opportunity to not only celebrate but to reflect and also to see, the future that we want. And there, I think these, serious questions or issues of how to eliminate the scourges of war, and this good opportunity for us next year. So I think we can all
Great.
our business.
Beautiful. I think I'm gonna leave it at that. It's expanding of the higher optimism of the opportunities in the future. Thank you so much. Please stick around and grab a glass of wine for us. This is, of course, just the beginning of a conversation all day tomorrow across the street. Please, thank you so much for coming.